Hi, everyone. My name is David Fauser, and I'm here for the BL1009 Environmental Science Workshop. Now, I just held this workshop live earlier this afternoon, but I was really unhappy with the quality of the recording from that session. So I've decided to re-record this from the comfort of my home. So I'm going to walk you through what I discussed with students live earlier and present some key information about this project that we have undertaken together. Now, the purpose of all this, of course, is to do this. Um, the idea here is to give students an introduction to some of the key concepts and methods of environmental science. And I'm going to bring in my own particular discipline of environmental history as well. Really, what we want to do here is to identify, describe, and perhaps even manipulate the sort of fundamental characteristics of our environment. And really for environmental science, this means field work. This means getting out into outside, examining water, examining soil, looking at the various species, exploring ecosystems, in particular, often identifying human effects on the non-human world in the forms of pollution, habitat loss, and so on. Now, the particular circumstances of this module make that kind of practical application difficult. So what I wanted to do in this particular workshop is to focus on the big picture, and that is to give all of you a good idea of one of the key ways that human action is causing environmental change globally. And this is really important because if we understand the big picture here, then when you go and do the continuing research on this small project, you will go out and you'll find a particular environmental effect of food production. But seeing all of this together, I think you'll have a better appreciation of the big picture of how human actions are systematically driving massive environmental change all over the world. Okay, so to go through this, what I wanted to do was begin by discussing a really fascinating paper that came out last year from a historian at UC Dublin named Susan Flavin. She gave a terrific talk at UCC in early 2022 about food being served at Dublin Castle in the late 16th century. Now, the historical background of this is that she discovered a set of these record books that kept accounts of all the food that was bought and much of the food that was prepared and served at this castle. Now, this castle is kind of special. This was the home of a particular William Fitzwilliam, who was the Lord Deputy of Ireland at the time, perhaps the single most important political individual on the island of Ireland at that time. He was the deputy of the crown, of the King of England. And not surprisingly, his diet reflected a very high status. He ate a number of foods that were exotic luxuries that were designed to show everyone how valuable and important he was personally. But at the same time, the records of Dublin Castle also indicate that a great number of sort of ordinary working people were fed there as well. And so it's not all fine dining for the Lord Deputy. It's in fact the entire community of the castle, which included a variety of important officials, but also many just regular working people. So in that sense, this paper actually gives us a really fascinating look at a diet in Ireland more than 400 years ago. And so having gone through this paper, what I found is there's 65 to 70 species in total that are dealt with at all. And I wanted to sort of break them down into different categories. And so I looked at the items that were clearly sort of staple dishes for normal days or for sort of working people. Then I found a category of items that were higher quality, sort of fine dining for more important people. And then there were a handful of items that we might consider to be sort of luxury products, like the true cream of the cream luxury products. So I'm just gonna walk through these species, and I want to identify what it is people were eating at Dublin Castle more than 400 years ago. And the first thing that jumps out is when we talk about staple dishes, we see a fair bit of meat. In fact, it's likely that people at Dublin Castle were eating more meat than just about anywhere else in the region at the time. And cattle, beef, did make up the bulk of their meat. They also ate a great deal of mutton. They had lamb as well, but mutton was a big part of the diet, as well as chickens, both the meat and eggs. Rabbits played a particularly important role, and there were some mentions of pork products, although not that many. It was relatively less important. In terms of staple starches, they ate a ton of wheat. They drank a lot of beer, which indicates barley, and almost certainly used a fair bit of oats. Now, it is noted in the logbooks that hops was important for the manufacture of beer. So we might think of this as a set of staple starches that people consumed regularly. When we come to look at like the various sort of fruits and vegetables, we see an interesting blend, some that are quite familiar to us today, and others that seem, quite exotic, but are sort of kind of unknown to us. They're no longer cultivated widely. So we have apples, onions, parsnips, skirrets, leeks, peas, a variety of things that were just referred to as herbs. Presumably these are leafy greens of some kind, but it's not totally clear. A few specific varieties of pear and apple, a species of plum called a bullace, cherries, as well as walnuts, cabbage, which of course is familiar to us today, lettuce as well, samphire, a fascinating little plant that is native to Britain and Ireland, but does not seem to be in anyone's diet anymore, and radishes. Now, as far as fish goes, fish was a major part of the diet at Dublin Castle at this time, and these three fish were staples, but these were all served as preserved fish, where they would be caught somewhere in the waters, uh, the Irish Sea, definitely, but also off the coast of the southwest part of the island. These were cod, ling, and herring. So these are everyday staples. Well, every week, often they were typically eaten on fast days, and they were, by all accounts, they were none too popular. Now, for fine dining, there's a different variety of things here. And what we get is wine, which is, as I'll discuss in a moment, was imported. So Spain and Portugal, most likely, some from France. There is sugar, and I'll come on to this in a moment, but it's difficult to tell precisely where the sugar is from at this point, but they were definitely eating sugar cane because they spent a fair bit of money on it. And then we have a huge range of birds. They ate a lot of different kinds of birds. Stints, curlews, godwits, gulls, mallards, ducks, woodcock, partridge, larks, blackbird, as in 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie, herons, cranes, barnacle geese or brants, oyster catchers, rails, bitterns, and even a few turkey. Now, um, most of these species are local to Ireland, and in fact, commentators at the time discuss how much wild game there was. There was a ton of birds around. And I think environmentally speaking, we might look at this and recognize that that indicates to us that there are widespread habitats for these kinds of animals, many of which are most at home at the interface between the land and the sea. They want coastal wetlands of some kind, whether it's salt marshes or something else. There was more of that kind of environment 400 years ago in Ireland, and so there were great flocks of these birds. Commentators will discuss the enormous sizes of the flocks of these birds. So although these are relatively fine dining, in the sense that they're not everyday staples for people, they are widely available and they are eaten pretty frequently. There's also a whole range of fresh fish. So note that previously I mentioned that there were some preserved fish. There's a bunch of fresh fish as well. Salmon, mullet, bass, razor clams, cockles, haddock, plaice, flounder, gurnard, ray, whiting, sole, trout, oysters, and lobsters. And all of these are caught locally in both rivers and the sea. Now, interestingly, as far as fine dining vegetables go, the only one that seemed to fit the bill from Professor Flavin's account is artichokes, which she mentions were served at one particular dinner. So artichokes perhaps were a bit of a luxury. Now, lastly, we have a few items that are sort of special, that are only mentioned on particular occasions, or that are sometimes given as gifts because they're so rare and so valuable. And at the top of the list here is venison, which is, of course, deer. Um, at the time, certainly there would have been wild deer in Ireland, but they were often restricted in that there were laws against hunting them. And this was true in many parts of the European continent. Several other game birds as well, particularly pheasant, was considered to be a real luxury. And then we have a range of what we might think of as exotics, right? Like truly exotic spices. These are the kinds of things that were not produced locally, but that were instead imported from a great distance, from Asia or somewhere. Pepper, cinnamon, these are both from South Asia. Ginger, nutmeg, and mace, which is the same plant but different parts of the fruit, and it's native to what is today Indonesia. Aniseed, caraway seeds, cloves, licorice, and even saffron. So this then is the set of species that we can expect to see in, the last quarter of the 16th century at Dublin Castle. Now, if we were to say ancestrally, where are these species from? And we try to place them. And now this is difficult. It's not always clear. Many species are from very wide ranges, but are only domesticated in certain places. But I tried my best to identify the ancestral origins of everything here and to map it out. What you get is something like this. It works best if you do regions. It's kind of difficult to do countries because, of course, countries change, and generally species don't really care too much about national borders. So the first thing that stands out when you actually look at the origins of these species is that 87, or sorry, forget one point here. I wanted to give particular weight to the staples, so I counted the staples as 5, and I counted the fine dining as 2, and I counted the luxuries as 1. So that gives us a much larger number, but it helps us to see how staples carry a much greater weight, right? So when you look at it that way, 87 of the particular instances of food being mentioned are sort of wild species that can be found across Eurasia, throughout the North Atlantic, many of them throughout the Northern Hemisphere overall. 81, only slightly fewer. 81 are species or are instances of species being discussed that are from Southwest Asia, like the Fertile Crescent, essentially. Fair numbers from East Asia and Central Asia, relatively few, perhaps surprisingly few from Europe and the Mediterranean. Kind of expected a little bit more there. And then a handful from a few other places. Only 5 instances of species coming from, sort of food items coming from Ireland and the UK, sort of ancestrally. Okay, now, when we look at the actual places that the particular foods that were being consumed in Dublin Castle came from, this necessarily involved a bit of guesswork because the logbooks did not actually specify all of these things. But given what we know of trade networks in the late 16th century and sort of economics of, what is being produced where, uh, it looks roughly like this. If you take all the various instances of the various foodstuffs, you get at least 171 instances that are from Ireland itself and the waters around it. Spain and Portugal were the biggest suppliers of sort of imported goods, but there was only 6 instances of this. It was the wine, basically, and possibly the sugar, which may have come from the Madeira Islands. And then the rest, these are just a handful of things. And I think what we're seeing here is that these are just a handful of the luxury products, right? Now, if we map this out, we get something like this. We can see here then that the ancestral origins uh, are heavily concentrated in the Fertile Crescent, in the sort of in the Middle East, basically. A fair number from East Asia and Central Asia, rather fewer from Europe and the Mediterranean, and a few from Southeast Asia or South Asia. Nothing at all from the New World. So at this point, before the year 1600, Dublin Castle effectively is not consuming really anything from the New World. Possible, like nothing that like originated there in any case. And yet, so this is where the species are from originally. But in many cases, these species were domesticated thousands of years before the account that we're talking about. And so what has happened is that these species have been sort of taken by humans, moved around the world, and each time humans do this, they alter landscapes in order to do so. They clear forests, they alter waterscapes, they remove species that they don't want and replace them with species that they do want. And that creates um, a sort of a set of connections between Dublin Castle's diet and the rest of the world that looks rather like this, in which, despite all of these species originating kind of all over Eurasia, they're actually grown generally or caught in Ireland. Only a handful of things coming from abroad. And so, really, then I think what we should take away from this is that around 1600, Ireland was in some ways like largely self-sufficient in food. It imported a few products, not very many. It was self-sufficient in food, but the cost of being self-sufficient in food means tremendous environmental change. It means taking species from all over the world, bringing them to Ireland and cultivating them here. Um, Now, it's worth considering, like, how might you expect this to be different for today? Because what we've done in this project is have students essentially compile the same information to find the ancestral origins of their food and then to find the current origins. Now, I had over 100 students respond to the survey that we put out, and they responded with a dizzying array of, of species that made up their diets. So there are some key things here. One thing that stood out to me is that although we have a wide range of species, it's not that much wider. And the absolute number of different species that are sort of being used here seems pretty similar. It's in this case it's 77. I think it's more here because the account books from Dublin Castle would not include some items that are here, and I'll point those out when we get to them. Um, there's a narrow range of terrestrial animals. Cattle remains like the big deal. Chicken also. More pork, and occasionally duck, but mutton, sheep of any sort, did not happen to make it on the menu, at least for this project. Although, of course, we know that uh, lamb is a relatively popular meat in this country. A different and narrower range of fish, so heavily focused on salmon, which is one of the most sort of commercially successful fish, along with tuna. Haddock, mackerel, squid, cod as well, and prawns. Similar staple grains, that is wheat and oats, although rice is relatively important, and American corn actually shows up a little bit too. One thing that's interesting about student diets at UCC is their reporting of a range of kind of legumes that we really didn't see at all with Dublin Castle. So chickpeas, and then a smattering of others. One of the things that I think is most fascinating is this huge, really different range of fruits and vegetables. And in 2024, as opposed to, say, 1594, New World species have assumed a dominant role. I don't think it's overstating it to say that Irish people, in many cases, seem to really eat a lot of New World species. Tomatoes and potatoes feature heavily, but also bell peppers, avocado, chili peppers of various sorts, uh, bananas. These are all New World species. Now, onions hang in there as well. There are some sort of old, some old classics here, carrots, cabbage still around, the various brassica family. But there's also a number of items that would be, were just completely unknown, exotic things in 1594. Say tamarind, coconut, passion fruit, absolutely fantastic that someone was cooking with passion fruit. The blend of spices uh, is actually, I think, reasonably similar. So we have turmeric, vanilla, neither of which were mentioned in Dublin Castle, but cinnamon certainly was, as was black pepper and mace. Um, One truly modern item that was wholly unknown to the 16th century would be manufactured bread soda, which is just, it's a chemical compound, right? This was not known in the 16th century. In fact, I don't believe it was invented until the 19th century. And one item that I realized that I forgot to include here are mushrooms. There were a good number of students, of UCC students, who did use mushrooms. Mushrooms do not appear in the logbooks of Dublin Castle, but that is almost certainly because they were not purchased. They were probably eaten, but these were things that could simply be gathered without having to go and pay for them. Whereas today, that is quite rare or even hardly done at all. Okay, so when we then map out the ancestral origins of the foods reported by UCC students, in a sense, we get kind of the same picture. Strong focus in the Middle East, as we saw before, and a similarly fairly strong focus in East Asia. But what's interesting is that we've added to this the New World, that New World species in the past 400 years have come to play a pretty significant role in Irish diets. And this really tracks with the origins of agriculture itself. We know that the earliest agriculture was in Mesopotamia, basically what is today Iraq, and the Levant region. The next major origin of agriculture is China, and following that, rather later, is Mexico and Peru. And so we might then look at this and kind of recognize that what we eat today are ancestrally plants from these particular regions that have been propagated around the world through human action with resulting environmental change. And that environmental change can be as broad as radical alterations in habitat, loss of biodiversity, extinctions of species, down to sort of more small scale issues in terms of things like water quality. So that if you cut down a forest and replace that forest with wheat fields, then you are going to alter the whole hydrology of the region. You're going to completely alter the microbial life in the soil. You're going to alter kind of the whole package of things. So these are where the species that we come from, and they are truly global. Now, when people were actually eating specific things, where did those things come from? This paints, I think, a pretty fascinating picture. And what emerges here is what I have indicated as Greenland, but this is what I've called unknown. Now, we should note that as with our first map of the actual origins of food in Dublin Castle in the 16th century, it was, there it was almost exclusively Ireland itself. Here, Ireland itself is, a smaller proportion, but still overwhelmingly the largest. 144 instances of food being described as coming from Ireland. That's a huge amount. And it's heavily things like eggs and meat and some cheeses. A lot of the dairy products, definitely butter was a popular one, but a fair amount of the produce as well. But then beyond this, we've got this big category of unknown. And the unknown were generally grains. So in a lot of cases, people used flour of some kind in some kind of baking, and that flour is extremely difficult to identify the origins of. It's pretty mysterious. And so in many cases, the flour would simply say maybe grown in the EU, maybe it would say North American. Just a handful of people were able to get flour and determine the actual origin of that flour. Now, beyond that, I was kind of surprised to see that Italy is such a strong supplier of food for Ireland. Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom all sort of figure quite prominently. And then there's a broad but fairly thin supply of food really from all over the rest of the world. A handful of items from Australia and New Zealand, South Africa, Madagascar, a few from the Americas. Now, what of course is the big picture here? The big picture here is that I mean, one takeaway that I have from this is that Ireland supplies more of its own food than I had expected. I was expecting to see somewhat less. And this is particularly the case given that right now it is spring and we are just really beginning the Northern Hemisphere growing season. And so I was expecting to see a much stronger representation of supply from the Southern Hemisphere. But really, there's not that much. There's not that much. A lot of it is still from the Northern Hemisphere, still relatively local. And I think that's frankly pretty encouraging because although this does require dramatic transformations of our own environment, if we are working in our own environment, we at least have the opportunity to see and understand and assess those changes. And in that case, maybe we have a better chance at trying to control them and manage them and ensure that they are positive, or at least that we mitigate the negatives as much as possible. Now, it will be up to you in your write-up to draw other lessons from this, but this has been a fascinating exercise. I really appreciate everyone's participation, and I look forward to speaking with you all again sometime soon. Take care.